Hi, and welcome to Why Do We Do That, a psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Todd Kashdan. Todd is a psychology professor and founder of the Well-Being Lab at George Mason University. He's produced over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles on well-being and resilience, psychological flexibility, meaning and purpose in life, curiosity, and managing social anxiety. In 2013, he was awarded the Distinguished Early Career Researcher Award by the American Psychological Association, and his research has been featured in hundreds of media outlets, including multiple articles in the Harvard Business Review, New York Times, and Forbes. He's authored 5 books, including Curious, The Upside of Your Dark Side, Designing Positive Psychology, and his latest book and topic of our conversation, The Art of Insubordination, How to Dissent and Defy Effectively. I thought it was very interesting how Todd, both in his book and in our conversation, demonstrates a very positive view of rebellion, whereas I, being a rule follower since childhood, am more likely to see rebellion as a selfish gesture that ignores the will of the group. That being said, I quickly realized that principled insubordination is very different from rebellion just for rebellion's sake. This distinction is crucial because it seems as though we are living in a time full of social unrest that is driven by unclear, or in some cases almost non-existent, principles. I think the greatest value found in Todd's book is the use of history to demonstrate how important it is for groups possessing minority viewpoints to view their opponents as potential allies in the future. Personally, I'm not a big proponent of activism in the form of sign waving or marching in public. It feels like more of an effort to belong to part of a group rather than to enact some sort of specific articulated change. Thankfully, Todd offers a variety of strategies to help groups become more effective at spreading their message, and also some ways to be a better member of the majority. If you are in the midst of an uphill battle to change minds, you should definitely pay close attention to what Todd has to say. Enjoy. All right, now joining me today is Todd Kashdan. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, great to be here.
So we're going to be talking today about insubordination. The title of your new book is The Art of Insubordination, How to Dissent and Defy Effectively. What inspired you to explore this topic? The book, ties together a bunch of different areas of psychology, attitudes and beliefs, persuasion, group behavior. What inspired you to package this all together to look at insubordination?
I love how you deconstructed a few of these components here. You could add in emotion regulation and personality. I mean, for me, this journey started 6 years ago, where I decided there was a question that I had of the literature, and it wasn't my area of study directly, which was, if you lack power and status, or you have a marginalized identity, what are the rules for being persuasive and influential, because you don't have the platform to get things going? And I spent 6 years reading the literature and realized nobody's been talking about this line of work in any way of selling it to the consumers outside of the academy. And during these 6 years, this is pre-Trump, this is pre-COVID, you have a number of sociological trends that were happening. And you start seeing is that the average person holds 12 jobs over the course of their adult lifetime, that the average age of a parent keeps on increasing with every cohort. The rise of social media, the increase of political intolerance, the increase of political certainty, the increase of political polarization, the social mobility where most people now live nowhere close to their family and friends. Right. So you put these and other sociological trends together and you're like, there's a lot of problematic and interesting social behaviors that are happening. What can you do to if you recognize there's dysfunction and things aren't working, to actually change things. And I wanted to create a manual for exactly how people can do this based on the best science.
So you discuss all kinds of different barriers to sort of effectively dissent. Where do we start? What is the reason why most dissent efforts fail?
The reason most dissent efforts fail is you have to think about, at the group level, there are a few norms that keep functioning at its highest level. So one of them is the norm that we're going to have harmony, we're going to have cohesion, we're going to be positive, and this thing called locomotion, which is you can think about this as firefighters. If there's a fire somewhere in the neighborhood, at the firehouse, when that alarm goes off, how quickly can people get into the fire truck and move towards the actual fire? So that's locomotion, speed of coordination. And groups that have dissenters, the cost is you slow down coordination and you slow down this locomotion. So goals take longer to acquire any type of effort, much less progress that happens. And if you're thinking about quality as well as efficiency for a group, dissent is one of these things where we could talk about the benefits, but it has a trade-off. And the cost is it slows the speed down of coordination, increases the amount of effort, and things become more high maintenance. It takes more energy than required to have interactions in a group when everyone's not in agreement.
So you bring up one of these repeating themes on this show, which is that we have these sort of mechanisms from our evolution that support some function that don't work as well in modern times. And it sounds like this sort of group cohesion was very important to early ancestors in survival. And now when it comes to modern day, when we're trying to simply express an idea that goes against the norm, we bump into these same the same pushback that you would get in pre-human times. What is so different about now that would cause so much friction?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, the evolutionary lens is a good one. Is the goals are more abstract, the outcomes are more abstract. I mean, think about a 12-person jury that's going to decide the fate whether someone goes to prison or not. So what the most important aspect of this is the outcome and the quality of the decision. But from the perspective of the individuals who are on the jury, just random characters that are chosen because they've been assigned this their local government, their objective is at arms with the objective of a good jury. So while a quality decision is great for the person who's being potentially sentenced, for the jury, it's how do I get out of here as quick as possible and back to my life? And I want this to be as non-boring as possible. Mm-hmm. So there are competing ends in terms of making something quick and painless and making something where I don't care how long it takes. The idea of someone innocent being put into jail is incredibly problematic. The idea of someone going to jail who is an innocent is incredibly problematic. And if we have to wait this out for 3 months, it's worth it. And with dissent, so Charlene Nemeth did this research about dissent in jury trials. And what she found is that if a single person dissents and everybody disagrees with them and the dissenter is totally off with their remarks, what it does is it increases the propensity of the other 11 people on the jury to seek out more and different information to make their decisions and spend more time thinking about the quality of their arguments, even if the dissenter is completely wrong in their logic. And that's kind of a great illustration where we have an inefficiency, but it leads to better high quality outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And you're sort of tiptoeing around this idea of conformity that as being one of these issues. Could you talk about conformity in terms of how it acts on individuals moving in a sort of marketplace of ideas?
Yeah, there's a new model by Justin Thibault, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, where he talks about conformity is this beautiful pro-social act where, because you care about other people's welfare and their well-being, you're going to act in a predictable manner. And then the other people that you interact with, they need less energy for this interaction. It's easier for them to come up with a response to whatever you did next. And everything is smooth and relatively effortless. So it's not just at the individual level. It's essentially, it's a gift that you're giving someone. So if I was to answer your question and say ice cream and potatoes and pause, I leave you with this incredibly difficult social situation where you don't know where to pick up and how to work with that content. I might have had would sound like I had a stroke in the middle of our conversation. And so conformity allows for less effort expenditure by every party that's in this social interaction that happens there. So at the group level, the more conformity there is, the greater the degree to which people feel good about what they're doing and they can work towards a common goal. And there's the pain pleasure ratio is in place where you have greater happiness, greater engagement, greater sense of meaning. And none of those three things have anything to do with, is the actual performance less or worse as a function of being happier, engaged, and have meaning there.
Now, you also mention, in addition to conformity, and you mentioned it at the top, which was the status quo, and that there is an incentive cognitively to support whatever the existing system is, right? It speaks to a line of research on a topic that's called system justification. So could you talk about what a system is and how it influences our motives in terms of stances on what is good, what is moral?
Yeah, to some degree, we can think of systems as just situational context. And so even when you think about personality, right, you've got Susan Cain's work, which has elevated the importance of being an introverted person is not necessarily a cost. It's often a benefit in some certain situations. Having people that contemplate more deeply before they talk, having people that actually spend time learning something before they offer an opinion, is a value, as opposed to an extroverted person who's more gregarious and more likely to kind of blurt out information in a social interaction. You'd want a nice balance of introverts and extroverts in a social situation. The problem with that model, that framework, is it ignores that whether or not we are introverted or extroverted is not necessarily stable. It depends on what situation we're in. And so, for example, for myself, I tend to be extremely extroverted, except for the bizarre scenario when I'm in formal dinners with large numbers of people. And there's something about the constrained way where there's people at the left, the right of me, and in front of me are not my preferred social interaction partners, but the ones I'm constrained to kind of make eye contact with and talk to. There's something about that rigid arrangement that makes me more introverted than extroverted. And everyone who's listening probably has domains or situations where their personality in some way perverts itself in a different way because it brings out certain sides of who they are. They're more conscientious maybe around their parents than they're with their friends. They're more open-minded when they're around people of a different race than they are with people who are that of the same race. And one of the beauties of psychology is learning what is your profile of personality attributes in particular situations. And in the same vein, when you think about focus, do you agree or disagree with the conventional mainstream thinking in a system? It's going to be influenced by what that system is. And so you have a system in the workplace, you have a system in your household, you have a system in your neighborhood, you have a system in your social group, and you have a system when you're around strangers. And each one of us has a profile of the degree to which we are going to deviate and feel comfortable deviating from the conventional majority of thinking in those groups. And it's not going to look the same across the board.
So in the book, you talk about in terms of dissent, you focus on this idea of principled dissent. So when you're in these situations that, there is sort of a there is sort of uh, or disagreement just for disagreement's sake, or just to forward one's own agenda. But principled dissent or principled insubordination is sort of what you're focusing on, which is when you have some sort of deeply held belief, or you have an observation about norms that you think isn't morally correct. Now, my question for you is that, isn't it the case that the degree to which insubordination is principled, isn't that just decided by the majority to begin with, right? It makes sense on the surface to have a belief driving insubordination, but oftentimes the value or the legitimacy of that belief is determined by the majority, which makes it sort of, it kind of murkies the water to determine the difference between principled versus non-principled insubordination.
I love where you're going with this. So I think this is at the heart where people have their biggest challenges, is who gets to decide what's principled and what's not principled, and who in their right mind thinks that they're engaging in unprincipled dissent, except for a bunch of rowdy teenagers and people that are on spring break.
Yeah.
Let's take a concrete example. We'll kind of play with it, and then we'll kind of walk through this conversation of what's principled and what's not. Okay. And perhaps this illustrates where the majority is often very off, and they know it once principled dissent takes place. So I'll just take the latest historical example that I was reading lately, which was Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady for FDR, considered one of the top 10 presidents of all time by historians. Her role is often missing in historical annals. Now, what was interesting about Eleanor was that when FDR was running for governor, it was at that time that she realized, I don't just want to be going to tea parties and having conversations with women about gossip and about social life. I have a lot of social causes that I'm interested in. Particularly, she was interested in the downtrodden and people that were low in poverty at the time, which, if you know anything about FDR, signed the New Deal, this was his biggest accomplishments as when he was in office. When FDR became president, Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady who said, I'm going to carve a niche for myself that will be a supplement to what the White House's power can offer, as opposed to being at the whim and at the helm of my husband. So she created a column in, if I remember correctly, it is the Woman's Home Companion. And she basically told everyone in the world that if you write a letter to the Women's Home Companion, I'm going to have a column and I'm going to respond. She got over 300,000 letters that were asking her for advice, and she responded to all of them. Now, whether it was directly or indirectly, it's a fantastic compliment. And what she did was she compiled all that information as data, where this was in some ways a snapshot of where people were suffering throughout society all over the United States. She gave us information in condensed form to FDR, and it was from her knowledge that he ended up creating the legislation that he was actually interested in as the president. But she did something else as well in terms of her principal deviance, which was she held meetings with radio correspondents who were the news anchors at the time. And she would only speak to them if they had a woman correspondent on their task force. And so way ahead of its time was that she would not meet with a radio media entity unless there was a woman on their task force. So we can both say historically, at that time, mid 20th century, this is a huge act of insubordination in terms of asking by sex, right, who I'm going to talk to from the media, and creating your own column where you're collecting information with under the auspices of the White House. So the majority at that time did not believe that women in office, much less women in general, should be exerting this level of authority in the government or in any organization. So she's already showing incredible level of deviance. Mm-hmm. Because of it became so obvious that the information she was collecting was so far surpassing the information that was collected by people around FDR. People realized very quickly they and the majority were in the wrong. She was in the right, and the progress itself proved, the power and the relevance of her work. And if we deconstruct that, you get to the elements of what makes principled insubordination. So, one of this is deviating from the orthodoxy or the mainstream. She did that in spades. The second part is authenticity. These behaviors and these norms that she was disrupting, it wasn't like someone gave it to her and she was signaling to the world, I'm a feminist. This was Eleanor Roosevelt. Like Eleanor Roosevelt felt, I'm going to be the first one to do this, not because I want to be in the news, because women should have a voice in society. Right. So she had the authenticity there. And the third part was the contribution. I can't even say on this podcast the letters and the writings that were kind of vitriolic towards her, but anyone that's familiar with Gamergate, anyone that's familiar with what it's like to be a woman, especially a Black journalist on social media, those are the kind of comments she was receiving in the mid 20th century. And this was it's one of the interesting parts of being a principled rebel. What is a detriment to the individual's well-being is an augmentation of the well-being of the group and society. And that's a contribution. She was willing to sacrifice her own psychological safety because she cared about the welfare of what it was like to be a woman in society.
Yeah. And, you mentioned lots of different examples in the book, and like they're really, really nice examples, these sort of positive, these positive stories of sort of minority viewpoints, developing traction and sort of changing the world. Lots of examples of that. But I'm curious as to how do you differentiate between sort of these good, authentic motives, or rather not even motives, but these good viewpoints versus bad minority viewpoints. And what I mean by that is, so one of the examples you mentioned is Charles Darwin, and how he had all these, he had these ideas that were sort of that were generally not accepted. There was a lot of public pushback. No one wanted to accept these scientific theories, and it fit this criteria of principled insubordination. But at the same time, the flat earther movement in the US or in everywhere else, the flat earther movement, right? People that believe that the earth is flat, it feels the same way. They authentically think the earth is flat. They're pushing back against a majority viewpoint. They're rebels, right? So, like, how do we differentiate between the two? Because they feel the same, right? They both feel like examples of minority viewpoints struggling to get traction.
Yeah, a great example. And there's a lot of interesting qualitative research about these flat earthers. So here, let me play with this from two different angles about flat earthers. So one angle is these are individuals that really love human nature and they love science, and somewhere, someplace along the way, things went awry. They didn't get the right teachers, they didn't get the right education, they didn't learn how to kind of sift through science and information. And so there's a level of backwardness, but we should have compassion, is that they really want to understand how the world works. So there are those flat earthers. There's another set of flat earthers that, and essentially, if you spend a lot of time reading about kind of how this movement is operating, where there is a financial incentive to be on the fringe, these conferences in terms of collecting advertisements, selling merchandise, and gaining a level of, for lack of a better word, there's a level of like insider cult status where it's us versus them, and they they're financially profiting off of that groupiness that occurs there. People who are at the helm of this movement of the flat earthers, they appear to be very well versed in astronomy. Carl Sagan, Richard Feynman, Oppenheimer, they seem to be aware of the world. And there's a level of cynicism. It's not, so you're missing the contribution part. Their mission isn't about contributing to an understanding of how the earth operates or how the universe operates. It's more about how can we find a sense of belonging and uniqueness, these two competing psychological needs, a place where we fit in and a place where we're unique and get to showcase that we are originals, we are ahead of the curve. We are the creative ones that are being ignored and persecuted wrongly. This group provides those psychological needs to be satisfied, but they are distorting or intentionally avoiding information that is really readily available, and they're not testing their theories. And in this way, you have so much motivated reasoning. You have such an unwillingness to realize that the contribution to society or the contribution to knowledge requires that you attend to other knowledge and information in that area. And the lack of that moves you down this dimension of from principled to sort of more reckless insubordination. And I think, you've got a criteria there. So it's not binary, it's a dimension. The more that you intentionally ignore information and selectively focus on low quality information to continue with your movement and your theory, the more you move away from the principled end. And you get closer to the January 6th insurrection that happened on the US Capitol, and you get towards, what information or evidence could you possibly give to somebody that believes that the current president of the United States did not actually win based on proper voting tactics, and that we should continue searching further and further despite level of evidence that throws counter to your theory. If you have unfalsifiable beliefs or you're unwilling to test them, you're moving further and further away from the principled part to the stubborn, reckless, and kind of more dangerous kind of forms of insubordination.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to the in sort of the research on grit. A big part of the research on grit is knowing when to quit something. And grit has all this attribute of being able to have a passion and motivation to achieve your long-term goals. It's very positive, move forward, strive, but a big part of that is knowing when to quit. And it sounds like what you're saying is that while these movements, flat earthers or even in general sort of conspiracy theory movements, their desire and their attitudes about rebelling aren't necessarily the problem. It's just sort of how they establish their criteria for success. Was that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, or their information gathering, right? How do they siphon what information is accepted and what information is rejected? And Ryan, we could play with a less known kind of fringe movement, which is, and this was started with Philip Dick back in the 1960s with the science fiction novels, who probably best known for Minority Report, because it was turned into a movie with Will Smith. And he has one of his novels, he talks about where neurodiversity such as Asperger's or anything on the autism spectrum, that this might be an early harbinger of another level of mutation that's evolution of the human species, where your emotions don't get in the way of logic and decision making. It's not a conspiracy. It's interesting. It's a dissenting view about thinking about neurodiversity. It's not a mainstream and orthodox view. And I would say is that there's a very principled exploration of, are we thinking about this too simplistically right now? And in this way, this deviation from mainstream thinking, I would view it as, based on the lack of evidence that we have right now, is that most of it is incredibly principled. It's not to elevate them and say, everyone is lesser than and should be given, less cash prizes, promotions, and jobs. It's saying that we might be misunderstanding a good portion of society. And so it's not just because a theory hasn't been proven that you're unprincipled. It's the way that you go about acquiring information and considering how you can test and falsify your information.
How important is the speed of belief change, or maybe I should say, what's the expectation of how quickly beliefs should change? So I have lots of progressive friends, and sometimes I get the feeling that they're extremely frustrated with how difficult it is to change the minds of people on the other side of the political spectrum. And it always seems to me as though their expectation is that you can sort of drown someone in facts, and then you have now achieved a positive outcome. In terms of what you've learned about successful insubordination, can you achieve shifts in the majority beliefs quickly, or does it have to be slow?
I am so glad that you're saying this, because if there's one of many reasons that I wrote this book, it was social activists today have a lot to learn from the science and earlier generations of social activists. In a second, I'll get to the gay liberation movement in the 1970s. I think is the greatest exemplar of a social movement in perhaps the course of human history. The speed to which you moved, I'm just jumping right into it. The speed to which you moved from 1971, where homosexuality was the #1 listed psychiatric disorder under the sexual disorder category, to 2020, where gay marriage is now legal across the United States. That period of time might feel like forever because it's a human being's lifetime. But in terms of major social changes in society, thinking a window of 50 years, I mean, it is incredibly fast. And I think that modern social activists, whether it's climate change, whether it's sex, gender, or race, there's a great deal to learn about this. That a few things. One is that be careful about obsessing about the speed to which you change people's minds, because it's a bad proxy for that you're actually going to make a durable influence in altering society. The second one about this is the early indicator that people's minds are going to be changed is not direct change, but it's indirect change. And I'll give you a concrete example about this. This is research by William Crano, where he shows that if you try to get people to change their minds about guns, ardent people, ardent fans of guns who live in hunting culture, that's how they were raised, more like in the Midwest and on the East and West coasts of the United States. These are beliefs that tend to be that guns are a fundamental value of being a citizen of the United States. They're strong, they're certain, and they're relatively low in malleability. When you try to convince someone because you know someone that was harmed or murdered with a weapon, or there was a recent shooting in the school, Sandy Hook. I mean, the idea that didn't change the clear behavioral evidence of the dangers of guns did not move the needle on gun laws tells you something about logic alone is insufficient, and the time frame alone can't be in a short period where you can expect change. What you often see when people change their minds is they might change their view to being more liberal or more open-minded about immigration, which is an adjacent issue that someone that believes in gun ownership and you can carry a concealed weapon into a mall tends to be having that belief is highly correlated with very non-permeable boundaries between countries for immigration. Right. And so if you try to convince someone's views on guns to change, you might not change their views there, but they might move the needle on immigration. It happens there. So we have to be very carefully and nuance in our observations about where people are modifying their thinking and their emotions about an issue, and not being hyper focused on just the exact precise thing that we want people to change their mind on now.
So what would you say is the recipe for a minority group, whether it's race, gender, etc.? What is the recipe, or rather the playbook, for the things they need to keep in mind to have a successful movement?
Well, there's a large number of steps, so we can't go through all of them.
Right.
But one thing that I think is often missing in these movements, you saw with Occupy Wall Street, you saw it with Black Lives Matter, and you're seeing a lot with a lot of the movements of diversity in the corporate world and in academia. And some of the reasons that they're not getting traction is because they're not attending to people outside of their belief system as people worthy of having a viewpoint that's considered. And let me kind of make this a little bit more concrete. If you want to increase people's propensity to believe that you should have more members of underrepresented groups in an organization, in the corporate suite, CEO, chief technology officer, you can comply people to do that. You could demand that we're just going to follow this rule, but you're not converting people's belief systems by doing that. Most organizations are using a power hold, which is, we're going to force people to have this belief. We're going to engage in this practice, but we're not going to try to change anyone's minds on this. That often leads to short-term, non-durable changes, where as soon as those individuals that were hired into those positions, as you hire the next batch of individuals, when they retire or they switch to another organization, you're rarely going to see the succession where that diversity will still stick, because you haven't changed people's minds on the view. The way to do this is pass the test of, are you an insider that understands the current majority that you're trying to infiltrate? And this is where current activists are missing this, is that there are a number of people in these organizations who have, lived different lives, brought up on different value systems, educated with different books, and they hold very stubbornly to kind of their current beliefs. You have to make an attempt to understand where they are. And by understanding what are the core values underneath, why they believe that the current system works as is and shouldn't be modified. And from that standpoint, there you point out, here's where the benefits are of having someone come in that doesn't look like you. And so you can imagine, and so you can present to them, this is plenty of data, the data showing that demographic diversity increases performance and creative thinking is actually very unimpressive. It's a very small correlation with demographic diversity and performance.
Right.
But there are interesting things that increase the propensity for having a larger concentration of non-white people in an organization, where an organization is more creative and performs better. One of them happens to be is you allow people to productively disagree with each other, and does not lead to relationship conflicts. It doesn't lead to backstabbing. It doesn't lead to gossip. It leads people to think that there are alternative ways of working on a task and figuring out which is the best way of doing things. If you create a culture where the norm is, I want people to think independently before I want to get your views independently. I want to anonymize it so people don't know who had which views. We want to work with the content that's there and critically think about the costs and benefits of those views. And our goal is not to have harmony or positivity. Our goal is to come up with the best solution, thinking of what's the exact outcome we want to focus on. These elements are often missing from these conversations on diversity. And if it was brought in, I think you would change more people's minds, and the whatever changes occur, they might be slower, but they'll be more durable. And I think if you really ask people, do you want change that's fleeting and quick, or do you want change that's durable that might take longer? I think most people would choose the latter, but we're really not having that sophisticated discussion.
Yeah, and it seems as though the biggest barrier has to do with that moment when a minority idea labels the majority as sort of enemy or evil, right? Because I think most people, even on the far left of the spectrum, far right politically, I think most people they don't mind having conversations and disagreements with big chunks of people. But there's this switch that happens when people have labeled someone as they are far gone, they're the enemy, we are at war with them. And it kind of shuts the door to all of these, what I would say is like effective strategies to gaining traction of a minority viewpoint or idea. Is there a strategy for cracking that, for sort of resetting people's brains and avoiding these sort of binary labels as enemy and other?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's seeds in what you just said about kind of just taking a dichotomous approach to thinking. Binary thinking alone is problematic. But just to go back a step to what you said, and I'm glad you said this notion of othering people. You know, when you've got Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, and it talks about, the elements of an effective workplace are that you can disagree and we will separate you, the messenger, from you, the message. And we're going to have a place where we're going to allow people to be vulnerable. And if you express things that are emotionally challenging for you, or express your adversity, or you express the fact that you previously suffered from depression, and you're currently about, in the early stages of a possibly another episode, or you're having trouble balancing parenting with work. If you were to reveal these things in a psychologically safe workplace, it's not kept in a file drawer and used against you at a later date. There are cues of belonging in a psychologically safe culture where if someone speaks, people put down their smartphones, they make eye contact, they're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, regardless of what you've said previously. So there's almost like a reset for each time that you talk, as opposed to labeling, oh, here comes the guy that's always going to say, be the contrarian in the room. Well, if you have that attitude of labeling them as a contrarian, you're going to miss when they actually are knowledgeable and pro-social contributors with good ideas to the group. What's missing in the conversation about psychological safety as an avenue to creating constructive dissent in a room is there has to be a reservoir of minority dissent so that you have a number of creative ideas to work with in the first place. So if you don't have the greatest predictor of creative decision making and creative solutions is the number of ideas that are present. And so if you only bring people in that are ideologically similar or have similar ideas about an issue, you decrease the number of ideas to work with to derive whatever solution or whatever decision that you're thinking of. And this is the value of having dissent. So it's in some ways, it's like a multiplication problem. You need psychological safety times the availability of regular doses of dissent. And only then do you get to the creative solutions where diversity then leads to creative performance that happens there.
One of the other issues, it seems to me, is that sometimes it's unclear who the rebel is in a situation. So, for example, let's take in the US the language debate in terms of whether it's race, gender, something like that. There are individuals that think we need to aggressively modify our language to be more respectful of certain groups, right? I'm intentionally leaving out specifics so that we can talk about like the generic issue. So some people might consider themselves the rebel for standing up for marginalized groups, and that's fine. It sort of adds up. It's a reasonable narrative. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have individuals pushing back and saying, like, maybe we're going too far with how much focus we're putting on language and how much focus we're putting on being politically correct. And that also kind of sounds like a rebel, like they're pushing back against this movement of policing language. So how do you tell if you're a rebel, if you could make a plausible story that both sides are taking the rebel standpoint?
It is an incredible sociological observation that you have here, Ryan. Right? In some ways, if we want to simplify it with the way that it's spoken about in public conversations, you have the woke and the anti-woke, and both groups think that they are, to some degree, like they are the principled rebels in the situation.
Right.
And then to some degree, I realize this is not the answer to your question. An interesting thing happened with both of these groups of dissenters from the mainstream, where a concentrated other group is formed of saying both of these groups might be lacking sufficient compassion about that they're individuals that are behind these issues that we're talking about. And this seems to be the interesting rising movement that there's not that much discussion about, because it's not neatly fit into the good gals and guys and the bad guys and gals. It's this group that's saying there are interesting points being made, but I see a lack of empathy and compassion, that there are individuals, especially younger individuals, where their real lives are at stake here. So I just wanted to kind of bring up it's not that there's three groups, again, it's a continuum that we were just kind of arbitrarily breaking into parts. And I'm actually really heartened to see that these compassionate people are starting on the rise of that our adversaries, and this is, I really feel strongly about this, that the way to approach these productive conflicts is that our adversaries today, you should be viewing them as potential allies later on, even if your side ends up winning. Like you shouldn't be in the place of ever sending an email to anyone on the other side that says, I won, exclamation point, exclamation point.
Right.
I think of John Rawls. He talks about the veil of ignorance, and his philosophical framework, I think, fits nicely here, which is you should imagine every issue that you have with the mainstream current systems that are in place, current organizations where you see problems, dysfunctions, and stagnation. Everywhere, every norm, every behavior, every rule. You should be thinking, when you think about solutions, you should imagine that you don't know what your position is going to be in the social network after this decision is made. So it's randomized. And, Ryan, you and I could end up being interns who are underpaid, underappreciated, constantly belittled, constantly bullied, as opposed to our positions now where I have tenure and I'm a full professor at a university. And when you use this veil of ignorance in helping you make decisions, it makes you think not just about where your psychological conflict of interest is. You're thinking about all the different players and positions that are possible where you could be randomly assigned to. And I think if we started our discussions from this place, from this framework, we would be a lot more compassionate from the get-go. You would be thinking about the college students in your classes, for me, and for if you're working in an organization, you'd be thinking about all the people that don't have the reserved parking spots and the six-figure salaries, of saying, if I could be randomly assigned to their role, would I be content that my health insurance would be taken away the second that I actually speak up and say, I'm not happy with what we're doing in the workplace? I think there's some ethical violations here. The idea that I no longer have health insurance for if I or any of our family members get cancer would make you think much more carefully about the bizarre idea that our currently assigned jobs, keeping them, no matter how problematic they are, is the determinant of whether you're going to be physically healthy. You would act differently from the standpoint of the veil of ignorance. So with this framework, you can envision that both sides are principled rebels. The mainstream is not actually an individual. The mainstream is the existing practices that are in place, and you're both fighting against it. So, and when So here's where it gets interesting. And this is debatable, and I definitely could be wrong here. And by the time this is posted, I could be wrong. When the incentives shift such that your speech or your belief or your thought on a topic is considered so abysmal and so problematic that you could immediately lose status in the community that you're in that case, you are now in the minority state. And so it's not, we can't make a broad stroke comment that those people that are asking for a alteration in language because it doesn't properly address all of the groups that are currently being acknowledged that have not been acknowledged in the past. We can't say it at a broad level automatically that they're all in the minority and those are the rebels, because as this starts to gain traction in certain organizations, they have the power to actually decide the fate of someone's employment and someone's health, because their health insurance is tied to their employment. And so we have to be looking a little bit more molecularly at particular organizations. We can't just say colleges. We have to look at individual colleges. And I don't know the answer because I haven't explored much the depth of the rules and the norms in individual colleges, except for my own. And I think this would require us to actually be a little bit more intellectually humble and say, I don't know what happens in your individual organization, so I can't say who are the principled rebels and who's the mainstream. But let's just say this, it is shifting quickly. And that's not to say this is no bearing on who's wrong or right. It's that we have to be very carefully aware of these power structures are not in cement, they're really in clay, and they are constantly being manipulated and modified. And right now, as an academic scholar, if I was to go onto a panel, the big smoking gun that someone could throw is to call someone a racist right now. That would be the end of my career that was happening there. So the power has shifted in that particular situation. And it's worth just having a candid conversation of where the power is, in what situations, and then we can start making changes. Because in the classroom, in terms of teaching evaluations, if you are non-white and non-male and the teaching evaluations are anonymous, the people that don't have power are people that are racial and gender minorities. But as soon as you have a live panel where people are on stage, it shifts and the power goes to people that are racial minorities and gender and sexual minorities.
To wrap up, I want to finish talking about one of the more, what I thought was one of the more profound parts of the book, which is this idea of the rebel's discontent, which is what happens when a minority viewpoint gains traction and ultimately becomes the new norm. And that there's this dynamic between rebels, that what you call the rebels that won, and the powerless former majority. What is the take-home point from this principle that you discuss?
Yeah, I'm glad we're ending on this. And I think this is the one that I really want people to think about, whether you are trying to enact change, whether you are a champion of someone trying to enact change, or whether you're on the sidelines and you have an opportunity to do a thumbs up or thumbs down to whether to keep things the way they are or make modifications of things. There are a number of constituents for every time we decide whether to make modifications or we decide we're going to double down and keep things the way they are. And we have to remember that every one of those constituents is a potential future collaborator and co-creator in what we're doing. And we have to be very careful about dividing the world into people that are good and evil, as opposed to individuals with different values and different stakes and different perspectives going into an issue. And one of the problems over the course of human history, for me, this starts with thinking about the French Revolution, is that once you storm the castle and you gain the power, you don't want to replicate the French Revolution and start beheading everyone who didn't agree with you before you started the fight. And there is a metaphorical beheading that often occurs as people gain traction and they win, which is they take such schadenfreude pleasure in the pain and suffering of people that were obstacles in the past. And I think we have to have a little bit more equanimity and a little bit more identity attachment to the issues that we're focused on, from the perspective of the individuals that lose in whatever issue or election that we are involved in. They're not going anywhere. And one way where I saw this happen in a problematic way in society was when Trump was elected, and there was a big outroar, across the country, 50% for, 50% against. 50% of the nation was disagreeing with you vehemently on this election. And I took a stand of that. Where do you want the people to go that disagree with you on this topic? So for me, as someone that's, a representative of the educational system, if you strongly believe that someone like Trump is not a problem to the democracy and the nature of a healthy civil society, I don't want you to be ostracized. I want you in educational systems, quick as humanly possible, to be around diverse individuals, hear their perspectives, read books by authors that they espouse, and have conversations where you can't control the narrative because there are multiple views, and you have in that room, and you have to look people in the eye and see the tears, the emotion, the hands that are shaking because it causes so much anxiety and unrest that happens there. And when you have those conversations, that's where the great opportunity changes. And the idea that you would ostracize individuals and let them radicalize further is exactly kind of, the concrete issue that I wanted to tackle from science, that this only leads to a destabilization society, not a more coherent and stable society.
I couldn't agree more. We are out of time. Thank you so much. Once again, the name of the book is The Art of Insubordination: How to Dissent and Defy Effectively. Todd Kashdan, thank you so much for being on today.
Man, you asked really tough questions, and I can't think of the last time I had to think this much in a podcast. So thank you.
For more on Todd, visit toddkashdan.com. That's TODDKASHDAN.com. Or check out his newest book, The Art of Insubordination: How to Dissent and Defy Effectively, wherever books are sold. Be sure to follow the Why Do We Do That Facebook page for updates and additional content. Don't forget to rate and write a review on iTunes. Follow on Instagram at Why Do We Do That Podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. And as always, feel free to email me at whydowedo-that-podcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?